Have you ever been playing a game and thought, wow, I'm so happy to finally have an escape from the real world? Then boom, a woke mob ruins your experience? Ah yes, trans characters in video games, a universally non-controversial subject matter that for sure does not devolve into bald guys complaining about pronouns. While this topic has been discussed at length for quite some time, I've been wanting to dedicate an episode to trying to unravel a question I've had in my mind for a while. What makes good trans representation in video games? I will continue to reiterate how subjective this is, and keep in mind, this is my opinion. I encourage you to actively think about characters you like and why you like them, or characters you dislike and why you dislike them. There's this research paper I stumbled upon while browsing my favorite social media site, Google Scholar, that aims to understand why some characters invoke a sense of euphoria and what elements were prevalent in trans characters and narratives that were successful in doing so. The way it's been organized features 3 boxes: design, dynamics, and experiences. Each of these include themes that are present in characters that survey respondents reacted positively to. We'll get into what those mean and examples within an array of games and characters that I think do a good job. Firstly though, it's important to say these aren't rules or anything. A character cannot follow these and be successful, or conversely, follow these all to a T and not be likable. I just thought it would be a fun way to structure this video. I found the paper really cool, and it really helped put a lot of the feelings I have about trans representation in games into words. With that out of the way, let's look at some case studies. Now the paper outlines 4 case studies within different games, those being Claire Russell in Cyberpunk 2077, Madeline and Celeste, Haru from One Night Hot Springs, and Animal Crossing New Horizons. We're gonna ignore that last one, partially because it's about character creation and that's a little bit of a different topic, though I will have a tangent about it later, and also because it's a little outside of my budget. I have about $11 and change I found on the bus, so shout out members and patrons. I also want to talk about Tyler Ronan from Tell Me Why, and Venture from Overwatch, because I like them, and the paper primarily focused on trans femme representation and experiences, but that's not all there is. Duh. Let's talk about Claire from Cyberpunk and why I think she's a really cool character. She's a bartender at the Afterlife, a location you visit pretty regularly, and upon meeting her, she's just a cool gal who serves you drinks. Eventually, you unlock her side story, which first involves you meeting up with her at her garage, and no way, what's that on her car? Let's talk about her design, both literally and narratively, which is focused on destigmatization and self-disclosure. When you first meet Claire, there's no way you can tell she's trans, and it isn't until you get to her garage and begin her story that you first see the flags on her vehicle. Now, having trans characters that pass and are conventionally attractive is something that I feel really mixed on. On the one hand, having a character like Claire, who is pretty and passes, works to fight against the stigma of trans people being unattractive. On the other hand, however, I feel like it promotes the idea that you have to be pretty and that you should want to pass. A lot of that is tied up with expectations of what femininity is supposed to look like, and that women in video games need to be pretty or a very vocal set of men get upset. All that said, I do like Claire's character a lot, because despite what I just said, I think her being into cars, being a bartender, shooting guns, being into the sort of stuff that gets labeled as masculine is really cool. It provides destigmatization in the way of showing that trans women, and really all women, don't need to have interests that are stereotypically girly to still be women. On the self-disclosure aspect of her design, I also appreciate how this is done because her story does not revolve around the fact that she's trans, and it's only after building trust with her that she mentions it when talking about her late husband. Claire, like everyone else, has her own shit she's dealing with. It just so happens that it involves trying to kill the guy she believed murdered her husband, but, you know, just like everyone else. This then leads into dynamics, specifically trans trust. To boil down the function of dynamics in this model is that while design is focused on the character, dynamics is the result of the player interacting with that design. What kinds of scenarios or spaces or relationships are created with said character, and how does player involvement influence them? For example, as you talk to Claire and develop a relationship with her where you both literally put your lives on the line while racing, the trust between you builds as she physically and emotionally lets you into her world, letting you drive her vehicle and then later opening up about herself and her own goals. While it may seem small, the fact that she doesn't explicitly mention her trans identity until the latter half of her story is a much more realistic portrayal of coming out to someone, rather than that being the first thing that she tells the player. Lastly in our model, there's experience, which is the culmination of design and dynamics. What does the player feel when they interact with this character? What do they take away from that story? The three outlined here are social, parasocial, and institutional. Parasocial is pretty self-explanatory. The player builds a positive relationship with Claire, though she cannot reciprocate those positive feelings, you still feel good going through her story. Social in this context relates to how Claire is treated in the world by other characters as well as the player. She is a role model in a very real sense. You, as the player, go to her to learn more about racing. She's more experienced than you, and it's clear that she's respected in the community. Lastly, institutional refers back to her design and how her interests and more masculine hobbies challenge the societal norms. The effect of that is that the player feels more comfortable and confident in themselves if they also fall outside of the societal norms. But what core concepts should we take away in an effort to create more positive trans representation in the future? The biggest one for me is agency and identity. I find that most often when a trans character is received negatively, the disclosure of their identity is usually the first sign that this character won't be all that great. Allowing a character or player to have the agency and the choice of disclosing their identity is super important. In Claire's case, being trans is clearly important to her, as the flags indicate. But that's not all she has going on. And when it made sense for the story she was telling, she chose to tell V about her identity because she trusted her. She didn't have to do this, but it was a sign of trust between her and the player, and I think that's crucial in her largely positive reception. To take a detour real quick, I do want to touch on character creation and the continuous struggle of representation. If you want a more in-depth look at this, I recommend this video here, it's really good. One point from that video that I was originally going to make this whole video about is the move away from male and female options in games to like body type 1 and body type 2, and how it's always been kind of weird to me. Don't get me wrong, I think shifting from male and female to seemingly less restrictive options when building a character is absolutely a step in the right direction. But like, it's really the same shit with a coat of woke paint, right? I was looking to see if anyone shared my opinions and very quickly learned that some do, but not in the same way. Because body type A/B is nothing but political conditioning backed by BlackRock and ESG financial scoring. No, that's not what I'm talking about. The binary is still very clearly here, as body type 1 can't wear body type 2 clothes in game. Body type 1 characters are always much taller than body type 2 characters. I can have boobs as the slender body type 2, but not as the more muscular body type 1, so on and so forth. Cyberpunk specifically is a sore spot for myself and a lot of other people because genuinely, why are the clothes gendered? I really don't get it in a lot of cases. Cyberpunk claims to have an inclusive character creator, but that basically boils down to I can look like a girl and choose my dick size, haha. Depending on what voice you choose, you will either get he/himmed or she/heard by other characters. I can't have the more deep voiced V and get she/heard or the higher voice and get he/hemmed. That's not even mentioning the lack of they/them or other options. Now, I really don't think every game needs a super in-depth, crazy inclusive character creator, but when you're promoting that as part of your game, I think it's kinda on you to go a little further. Fucking Pokemon Legends ZA, of all games, lets me wear whatever clothes I want, but I'm supposed to believe that in a cyberpunk setting where you can change parts of your body on a whim, I can't wear a non-cropped tank top just because the game won't let me? That's just a little silly in my opinion. Look, I'm gonna be real with you. I'm a stereotype. I wanted all the footage in this video to be my own, but I got so sidetracked trying to 100% Celeste that I had to stop playing in order to get work done. Madeline is one of my favorite characters in general, and I think she's incredibly well done, on top of Celeste just being such a great game. If you somehow don't know by now, Celeste is a game where you climb a mountain, and it's really easy for a guy like me. Madeline's journey up Celeste Mountain is really touching, and you can paint so many different experiences onto it. Despite the common consensus now being that Celeste is a game about the trans experience, that doesn't mean that anyone can't take something away from its narrative. Madeline's design primarily falls under the de-othering category, which may sound similar to Claire's destigmatization, but it's different in a really important way. Where Claire provides destigmatization as a visible and open trans woman, Madeline's more subtle approach utilizes de-othering as just being the main character in a game that also happens to be trans. While I think this is common knowledge at this point, Madeline wasn't initially designed to be trans. If you read the article published by Maddie Thornton, the creator of Celeste, titled, "Is She..." she talks about how Madeline was written from her own perspective. Later, after the game release, she learned that she herself was trans, thus also making Madeline trans too. We see hints of this in the free DLC added about a year after the game's release, where there's a pill bottle on her nightstand and a trans pride flag on her desk. Even before it was confirmed that Madeline was trans, many people already picked up on that, even if Maddie herself wasn't aware of it, and I think that's pretty neat. Because of Madeline's de-othering design, the dynamic she creates is labeled as safe spaces. This doesn't mean that Madeline creates a safe space separate from the rest of the world of Celeste, rather that because there is no judgment about her identity, the game space itself becomes a safe space. This leads into experience, which, similar to Claire, is categorized as institutional. Celeste creates a world in which transness is unremarked and unremarkable. A world where you, as the player character, don't have to fit into some societal structures that otherwise may try to force you out as a trans person. You just exist, and it's not a huge deal. Now, with the importance of agency and self-disclosure I discussed in Claire's section, it may sound a little hypocritical that I started this one off with how much I like Madeline, despite her coming out technically not being her own choice. You know, this article being published essentially outed Madeline, thus leaving her with no agency in the matter. The key difference here is that because Madeline was written from Maddie's own perspective, to me at least, it makes sense in doing it this way, and it's not like this wasn't something she didn't consider either. I'm going to read a few quotes from her article that I think sum up a lot of my own feelings from Maddie herself. We discussed this when writing Farewell, the DLC I mentioned earlier, and our conclusion was that we wanted to afford Madeline privacy. That yes, maybe she was trans, but it wasn't really any of ours or the player's business. She is a woman, a human being, and that's all we need to know until she decides that she wants to tell us more. I feel conflicted, even now while writing this, effectively outing her, because it doesn't feel entirely fair to her. It's the same consideration that I would want to be shown to me. In Celeste, I would argue that Madeline's transness is meaningfully intertwined with her story, but the base game was subtle about Madeline's identity and feelings, in part because I wasn't fully conscious of them, and their metaphorical connections to the gameplay. We preferred continuing that mode of communication over saying, yep, she's a trans. And so it's tough going about it in this way because on the one hand, if you don't acknowledge it, people may say that you're hiding her identity, a real concern for Maddie. But if you do publicly acknowledge it, others may get upset that she is trans or that it wasn't given proper courtesy. I think that Madeline's transness was handled the best it could have been. I think if Farewell flat out said she was trans, it would have felt unnatural for how the game handled its storytelling. Yes, the story is pretty blatantly a trans narrative looking back now, but even if you don't recognize that, Celeste is just a great game, and for me, a trans character headlining a beloved indie game is super cool. The last game covered by the research paper, One Night Hot Springs, was one I had never heard of, but it was free, so I downloaded it. Hooray! Hot Springs is a pretty short visual novel following Haru, a Japanese trans woman, and some of the everyday difficulties that come alongside that. There are like 7 endings, and I got them all in under an hour, so I encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. The basic plot is that Haru gets invited to the hot springs by her friend Minami for her birthday, who also invites her friend Erika. Both are cis women, and Yu and Erika have never met. Conflict arises because Haru is nervous about using the women's bath and making anyone else uncomfortable, as well as not knowing what Erika knows about her, and how Erika feels if she does know that she's trans. This was honestly way too relatable of a situation for me. Okay, well, there's not a single hot spring near me, and I'm extremely white, but aside from that, I do know someone named Erika, so I'm basically Haru. But seriously, this is a situation I am all too familiar with. Being anxious about knowing which bathroom I'm supposed to go into, not knowing if the people around me know I'm trans, and if they do, what they'll do with that information. It's a really heavy mental burden, and I was pleased to see how Hot Springs went about depicting an all too common situation, even if you don't have a hot springs near you. The game relies heavily on the design characteristic of self-disclosure. Pretty much every choice you make influences how many people around you know of your identity and what they know about it. For example, there's a scene that plays out around the middle of the game where if you chose to stay up with Erika, she asks you about being trans. You don't have to tell her anything, and the game can progress just fine. But if you do, you get a really sweet ending where the two of you go to the bath after hours. There's another ending where you end up telling an employee at the end who then makes arrangements for you to have a bath of your own so you're not uncomfortable using the public one, but it still allows you to have a fun time with your friends. We see 2 new types of dynamics here, being continuum of comfort and self-reflection. The self-reflection is pretty self-explanatory. You as the player are meant to think about your own experiences through Haru's own struggles. Continuum of comfort might be my favorite out of the themes discussed, as it provides a strategy for evoking comfort without erasing pain. To continue quoting, the heavy topics are balanced against the kindness of friends and the assistance of the Hot Springs staff. These everyday kindnesses embody hope for the future in the face of inequality. Hot Springs is able to put you in the shoes of someone dealing with these inequalities, ones you may be familiar with in your own life, but the purpose is not to invoke a sense of discomfort, rather to approach them from a safe distance with a support system in place. This is not to erase the pain and struggle that comes with living through these experiences, but it's supposed to show how there are ways in which you can confront and overcome them. The experiences invoked by the design and dynamics of Hot Springs are labeled as social, parasocial, and self-image. We're going to focus on that last one. Because the continuum of comfort is present, you as the player are able to look at the hope found in the world of Hot Springs despite the challenges and apply your own experiences to the game. My personal favorite ending is the one where you choose to stay up with Erica and she asks you about being trans. The questions she asks are a little prodding and you can choose not to engage with them. But if you do, you help her learn how to be more respectful and the two of you become friends. You both go to the bath after hours and talk about Minami and recount personal stories from your time in high school. It's really fun. I wish there was an ending where all three of you could end up going to the baths together, but I suppose in an effort to keep the game free of discomfort but also trying to remain grounded, that option isn't available. Another part I really enjoy comes from when you decide to get a personal bath. You see that they're all filled and you could either ask an employee or go back to your room. If you talk to the employee and kinda hint at why you don't feel comfortable going into the main bath, she upgrades your room so you can still have an enjoyable time. This isn't just a random act of kindness either, as later she tells you that she has a trans sister and wants to make you feel comfortable despite the challenges present. While admittedly this game is incredibly optimistic and unrealistic in many aspects, it's sweet and I appreciate what they're getting at. I think what should be taken away from One Night Hot Springs is that you can still acknowledge and have trans struggles be the main focus of your game, while still going about it in a way that creates a safe environment and paints a positive outlook for the future. A lot of Haru's choices make a lot of sense in my mind, and a huge part of that is that the game was created with personal experiences in mind by its openly non-binary developer. Striking that balance is tough, and not every player will agree with how you did it, but I think these types of stories work best when there is a genuine effort in approaching these sorts of situations. Tell Me Why is a game that I did not realize I owned until checking out E's video about trans representation in games and looking it up after they had a section on Tyler. Tyler Ronan, alongside his sister Allison, are the main protagonists that the player controls throughout the game. Similar to other Don't Nod titles, it's a third-person story-driven game with some spooky sci-fi elements thrown in. I won't be discussing the plot as much as the other entries here because our focus is pretty much exclusively on Tyler. I also don't want to spoil too much of the game if possible. But the gist is that Tyler and Allison are reunited after 10 years and revisit their home because their mother is dead. The game centers on them overcoming past traumas and learning more about themselves and their mother. Now, as a character, Don't Nod really wants you to know that Tyler was the first trans character in a game by a major studio, and they also really want you to know that they did it right. But more on that in a sec. Design-wise, Tyler sort of falls into both destigmatization and de-othering, which may seem contradictory, and yeah, it is a little. His design works under the destigmatization category because his identity is clearly stated and he is not portrayed in a negative light. However, I argue that de-othering also applies here because while yes, we do talk about his identity and it is known, it's not the entire main focus of the game, nor is it the main focus of his character. In that way, I think he works with both of these labels. Where it gets tricky, and I was racking my brain for a bit, is his dynamics. Eventually, I settled on a continuum of comfort and safe spaces with an asterisk. My reasoning for Continuum of Comfort is that while Tell Me Why is definitely a game where you encounter unhappy experiences, you also don't encounter any dysphoria triggers, and there are of course happy moments to balance out the spooky ones. Safe Spaces works here because Tyler isn't judged based on his identity, thus creating a safe space. Though I would hardly call the story of Tell Me Why a safe space in the same way that something like Celeste is, which is kinda why I bend the idea of the safe space here. Lastly, for experiences, I would say social is what stands out in Tyler's character. The fact that he does not get misgendered or dead named, aside from like the couple times in the beginning of the game where some characters use his previous mask name, ultimately creates a positive environment for his social identity throughout the rest of the game. What interests me most here are the reactions to Tyler's character and just what Don't Nod did to try to get him right. E also discusses this in their video, but I find this sort of stuff really important, so I'm gonna go over it too. Firstly, I do think Dontnod took all the right steps in creating his character, like working with trans staff between their studio and Xboxes, as well as having August Black, a trans man, voice Tyler and give personal insights in order to help guide his character. However, while some reviewers appreciate the lack of gender-related pain in Tyler's backstory and say that he feels like a breath of fresh air, others criticize Tell Me Why for playing it too safe with him within the story. I get both of these perspectives. On the one hand, having Tyler be a trans guy from the moment we pick up the game and his story not including if he did experience trauma specifically in regards to his identity or not, does feel kinda good, though it is ignoring a major part of the trans experience, and by glossing over all the negatives, it does give the impression of a more sanitized and brand risk-free idea of what it's like to be trans, especially a trans kid. So, to be a fence-sitter as always, I sorta agree with both arguments here, but if I had to choose, mainly because of the story Tell Me Why is telling, I would lean more on the side of the former rather than the latter. Truthfully, representing trans experiences alongside all the pain and trauma that comes alongside it is undoubtedly important. But Tell Me Why isn't about the trans experience specifically. Tyler has other shit going on. There's a lot more trauma to be unpacked, and that trauma is the focus of the game. He still goes through a lot and grows as a character because of it. So, in this context, I don't think focusing on his transness is really the point of the overall narrative. Still, I do agree that for being the first trans character from a major studio, he doesn't do much as far as pushing boundaries goes. But nonetheless, he's a neat guy who earns a spot in my cool book. Good job, Dontnod, kinda, I think. Lastly, and this is a bit of a funny one, but I do want to talk about Overwatch's only trans rep, Venture. I like Venture a lot, I think they're silly, and I love how much of the player base enjoys them. As long as they're not on the enemy team, then I can't stand Venture. Since Overwatch isn't a story game, nor does Venture's comic really go into their identity, it makes things a little different for our model, but I can still squish them into some categories. Design-wise, I think it's pretty obviously de-othering. Venture is a playable character like any other, except they just so happen to be non-binary. And talking actual character design for a second, I think Venture is so well designed, and you could tell this because people misgendered them both ways. But seriously, I think they have a really fun personality, a unique design, and cool motivations. As for their dynamics, I think safe spaces and self-reflection are the two standouts here. Safe spaces is a funny one because despite being on a team with literal terrorists, they don't dare misgender Venture, nor does them being non-binary impact any relationships with other heroes. In terms of self-reflection, I think Venture being a positive trans figure encourages people to think about themselves in a way. I know that they've for sure trans some genders, and while you may or may not relate to Venture's story necessarily, them just existing within the roster can evoke a sense of comfort. As for player experiences, external and parasocial themes are the two most prominent in Venture. External comes from the joy found in showing your identity to others. Not only can you do this with Venture's cosmetics in-game, but Venture themselves also does this from time to time, which I think is pretty funny.
You like this one? How does a non-binary ninja take out a target?
I'll bite. How?
They slash them!
Good one. Betcha 100 yen, Genji doesn't get it.
Parasocial represents the bond that you make with them, despite them not being able to reciprocate, kinda like with Claire. Oh yeah, I should mention that, like Tyler, both Claire and Venture have voice actors who share their identity with the character they're voicing, which I think is super awesome. I honestly don't have much more to say about Venture, given the less narrative focus of Overwatch compared to the other games and characters discussed, but I will say I'm just really happy to see non-binary reps in popular games. Other than Venture, there's Clove in Valorant, Bloodhound in Apex Legends, and of course Psy in BTD6. What I find even cooler about all these characters is the really wide range of designs, showing that there's no one way to do a non-binary character. I think the most important lesson that we can learn from Venture is that more games shouldn't be afraid of adding characters with trans identities to their rosters. Yes, you will have a vocal minority who are annoyed about it, but I know so many folks who gravitated to Overwatch because they thought Venture was funny, and I love that for them. I just wish they played a better game. I think everyone should get to experience seeing themselves in a character, and by making these games more inclusive, more people are able to have those moments.
Yeah, what happens?
But Goldie, I want to know how you'd write a trans character. Wow, thank you so much, Real Commenter. I'm so happy you asked. I'll try to keep this short, but using the lessons we learned today, how would I go about writing a trans character using some of the categories and examples found throughout? Well, firstly, this is so incredibly subjective, probably more so than anything else discussed, so please keep that in mind. But secondly, I think it really depends on the context of the story being told for me. If this hypothetical character was in a game about the trans experience, I would want to focus on hitting destigmatization, self-disclosure, self-reflection, and institutional experiences. In other words, I would want said character to be explicitly trans in one way or another, and I think getting agency in how the character discloses that to the player or an NPC is really important. As for self-reflection, I initially wanted to say continuum of comfort alongside it. However, as I stated when talking about Tyler, I think in a narrative about the trans experience, we have to have those uncomfortable situations dealing with trans-related trauma and dysphoria, which is why self-reflection is so important here, encouraging a player to reflect on their own lived experiences with the distance and safety, not to be confused with comfort of the game, representing those experiences. Lastly, I like the institutional experiences because they do push against established norms, like with Claire liking typically more masculine things, and I believe going against societal norms is a key part of the foundation in telling a trans narrative in this context. Now, in a game that isn't necessarily about the trans experience, I think I would opt for a character closer to Madeline or Venture, one that focuses on de-othering, safe spaces with social and parasocial experiences. A character that may just happen to be trans in a game about something else. I think that represents de-othering kinda on the nose there, with the safe spaces coming from the fact that their identity isn't the focus of any sort of discrimination or pushback from other characters. And with social and parasocial experiences, well, I would just want the other characters in the game to respect them and for the player to like them. This character's transness is unremarked and unremarkable. They're just like everyone else. To close, I want to restate that I think trans representation, specifically in the medium of video games, is so important, especially right now. Trans people, and really people within every marginalized group, have always and will always continue to work on video games in some capacity, and I love that. I'm so tired of seeing people say that X game failed because of woke, when really there's just way bigger issues within the games industry that have failed to be addressed time and time again, thus causing so many games to feel rushed or buggy and end up dead on arrival. Referring back to Maddie Thornson's blog post about Madeline, she had this to say about trans representation in gaming. Here's something that definitely isn't true. The reason trans representation is important is because human beings can only relate to characters who are identical to themselves, and any gains in trans representation come with an equal loss for cis folks. That's ridiculous, and actually the opposite is true. People need to see and feel the experience of those different from themselves, especially from less privileged groups who they share society with but wield outsized and often invisible power over. Trans folks and other marginalized groups have a lot to teach that will help everyone. If you're cis and Celeste helped you, that's awesome. That simply means you learned something about yourself from a trans story. It kind of reminds me of men who refuse to play as women in video games, or cis people that don't want to relate to a trans character, and they're just causing themselves to miss out on so many great experiences. It's genuinely mind-boggling. My whole life, I've had to relate to the tough guys that were featured in games I played growing up, but that's just how things were expected to be. This isn't to say I can't relate or didn't like games featuring all cis characters. No, a lot of my favorite games don't even mention being trans. So why can't this go the other way? Why is it a problem only when people have to walk in my shoes and sit their ass down and play as an awesome double jumping trans woman instead of white dude number 7? If anything, I hope to get to see a future where having a trans character in your game isn't a sign of conflict, nor a sign for celebration. It's just a thing that happens because it happens in real life too. Just like Claire and Haru and every other character mentioned here, I got my own shit going on. I just happen to be trans on top of it all. Now, if you'll excuse me, one of the most pressing issues in my life is writing angry emails to Minecraft.com about their addition of the trans zombie.